Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Independent Thought. My name is Desmond Price. First, I want to say welcome to any new listeners and welcome back to my subscribers. Thank you for listening to Independent Thought each and every week and hitting that subscribe button. If you are a first-time listener and you're unfamiliar with the podcast, you will be noted to know that this episode, like most of my episodes, are split into two halves. And the second half of the conversation after the break will be a brand new one with my guest for the week. Now, as I have been alluding to some people on Instagram and Twitter, I am today reacting to all of the noise with Joe Rogan, all of the calls for him to be censored, removed from Spotify, the terrible videos that we've seen come out about him where he just relentlessly says the N-word over the years. Going to be talking about all of that today. But if you are looking to get my reaction on this Joe Rogan thing in the next 5 minutes, you have obviously never been to my podcast before. We don't really do 5-minute takes around here. It's more like 20 or 30 minutes. So if you don't got that kind of time, I understand. This is going to be a little bit. Let me just start right off from the beginning, just in case some people were here to, want to know right away whether or not I think Joe Rogan should be censored. The short answer is no. The short answer is no. If that's not what you wanted to hear, I understand. I'll see you in the next episode. But allow me to take a few minutes to explain why I've come to that conclusion. So I'm going to go piece by piece and kind of break down what my thoughts are on this situation. We're going to talk about the perception that's around Joe Rogan's podcast, the claims that have been made against him for spreading vaccine misinformation, the racist language on his podcast, and then finally, why exactly did I come to this decision about whether or not I do not believe that Joe Rogan's podcast should be censored or removed from Spotify. So let's just start out with how this conversation really got going. Because I know that some people have been talking about this for a while, but this really ramped up a few weeks ago when Neil Young first wrote a letter to his manager that he asked me to deliver to Spotify on his behalf, where he said, either it's me or Joe Rogan. You can't have both. Basically telling Spotify he was giving them an ultimatum and that he would not share the same platform with someone who was spreading vaccine misinformation. Now, this kind of led into a spiral of a bunch of people, on Twitter and other places on social media asking Spotify to remove Joe Rogan's podcast. People were posting screenshots of them like deleting their Spotify accounts, deleting Spotify premiums, asking for boycotts of Spotify if they didn't remove his podcast. And so that's when this first came on my radar. And I had to ask myself, why now? I guess. I mean, Joe Rogan's podcast never really been the most politically correct place in the world. Definitely not. And he's had some very questionable guests on over the years, which we're going to get to in a little bit here. But I wanted to kind of put my cards on the table a little bit here because I have listened to Joe Rogan's podcast over the years. Not an avid fan. I wouldn't even call myself like a fan, but I have checked in a few times over the years, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 times over the years. In no way, shape, or form would I ever say that I think this guy is great or that he's someone who should be worshipped. I'm not really in that camp. Honestly, the guy's a moron, and he'll be the first to tell you that himself if you ever listen to him speak. Truthfully, if you listen to the Joe Rogan Experience, you're really going there to hear whatever guests he has on. And for those who are unfamiliar with this podcast, I think the perception being laid out in the media right now is that the podcast is like giant, like tube of right-wing conspiracy theory type nonsense, the kind of like akin to what you might get on Newsmax or InfoWars or Tucker Carlson on steroids. And that's just really not what that podcast is. It's normally just these most out of left field conversations. I mean, they're usually just absolutely nothing that'll get talked about. Pop culture, ancient civilizations, comedians and actors will come on there. I one time tuned in for an episode where it was an astronaut talking about what it was like to be in space, and that was honestly captivating. But yes, sometimes political figures do come on, both on the left and the right. Notably on the left, David Pacman, Crystal Ball, Kyle Kalinske, Bernie Sanders, and Dr. Cornel West. And I think my favorite person that I ever heard listen to on there was a man by the name of Daryl Davis. He's a Black man who actually was able to convince more than 200 KKK members to leave the Klan. Admittedly, though, this probably goes without saying for those of you who have read the news, because the news pointed this out several times. He's had on some terrible fucking guests. And I'm not going to defend this in one way or another, because Joe Rogan has had some terrible guests on. And there are people that I understand, like having a platform where you would like to maybe share the mic with somebody who has different political views than you. But some of these, I find to be very questionable. I mean, Steven Crowder, Jordan Peterson, the leader of the Proud Boys, Alex Jones, multiple times. I would never even conceive or consider having Alex Jones on any platform. I'm going to rail against the idea of censorship here later on in the podcast, but there's exceptions to every rule. And I'm completely okay with someone like Alex Jones being censored and basically kicked off the internet to the ends of the earth. But, with that being said, should Rogan be censored for this particular case? And some people were saying that he just platforms a bunch of people who shouldn't have platforms. And I just do not believe that in and of itself is a good enough reason to censor somebody. I mean, yes, I wouldn't have had people like that on my show, but, I also do not believe that censoring someone for having political discussions with, somebody who is a conservative or who's an extreme, like right-wing conservative, is enough of a reason to essentially remove somebody off of a major platform like Spotify, or to be censoring them in general. And just going a little bit further into this discussion, I think right now, in a broader sense, we have become so tribal with our politics that we're almost afraid to even hear an opinion that's outside of our own. And I do think it's in a lot of ways healthy to actually hear the stance and the takes of people who disagree with you politically. I think that's a healthy thing for everyone, to get outside of your bubble occasionally. It's amazing how insulated I think we all are in social media right now, that we've kind of had these curated political bubbles for ourselves. It almost like leads people to believe that there are not other people who feel differently, or that they must be on the fringe if they don't think the way that we do. But that's a conversation for a different day, when we talk about how algorithms are curated and how our social media preferences really kind of warp our perception of reality. But I guess in a summarize, as far as the perception of the podcast is concerned, the media, it would seem, would have you believe that this is some crazed podcast that's just always about politics. That's not really true. And there are somewhat of a balanced levels of both left and right political figures who do come on there. Although I will say that there have been more right-wing voices on the Joe Rogan Experience than left-wing, but it's not really what it's being made out to be. But let's go on to the anti-vax conversations that people have been referring to. This really has popped up by two doctors who came on to Joe Rogan's podcast, Dr. Robert Malone, and I believe his first name is Peter McCullough. These two doctors came on to Joe Rogan's podcast, I believe, within the last year. They were two different 3-hour discussions. Now, these are the discussions that most people are pointing to when they're talking about that Joe Rogan is spreading vaccine misinformation. So these doctors came onto Rogan's podcast, and they went on and made several claims that these mRNA vaccines, like the Pfizer Moderna ones, were risky, saying that they had dangerous side effects. They said that they should be, instead of pushing these vaccines on people, that they should be advocating for natural immunity. The doctors also advocated for ivermectin and hydrochloroquine, two medications. And they were saying that public debate over COVID-19 has been unfairly censored. So, is it okay to have conversations like that on a podcast where millions of people are going to be tuning in? That's very conflicting for me. I mean, I think the way that he did it, I think was irresponsible. I think it was very irresponsible. I think if you're going to have those conversations, it needs to be prefaced with saying that the information that those doctors are presenting are going against national standards for, implemented by the CDC and the WHO. But the more complete way to go about it would have been to have had, if you're going to have that level of dissent coming on to a podcast of that size, where you have that type of influence, you have to, I think, in my opinion, have another doctor on who could challenge those narratives in real time. Now, Rogan did have another doctor come on to the podcast, I think, after these two doctors, Sanjay Gupta, who is the senior doctor who works for CNN. He did go on Rogan's podcast and spent 3 hours talking with him as well, also basically trying to rebut some of the information that had come out of these two other podcasts with Malone and McCullough. I would have preferred to have seen Gupta in a conversation with Malone or with McCullough so that they could have discussed these things in real time, because the fact of the matter is that there are some people who are still vaccine hesitant. And I just feel as though that what really needs to happen for some of these people is just to have these conversations just hashed out in real time so that they can hear both sides of the arguments. And someone who actually has better information, someone like a Sanjay Gupta, would be able to explain in real time why these other doctors' claims are not legitimate. So, but at the same time, I do want to address something else here. The way that that is being perceived with Rogan's podcast is being perceived as though his podcast is somehow leading to a massive amount of like vaccine hesitancy here in our country. And I just got to say that the numbers really don't support that. I just want to throw a few numbers out to people, just in case you're not aware of currently what is going on in our country as far as vaccination rates. As of today, 75% of all US adults are fully vaccinated. That is as of today. 87% of all US adults have had at least one dose of the vaccine. Now, I just want to take a moment to kind of appreciate those numbers, because with all of the vaccine like disinformation and misinformation that is out in the open right now and has been for the past year, those are staggering numbers. Those are staggering numbers that in less than a year of basically accessibility to the public of the vaccine, that we were able to get 3/4 of the adult population in the country to be completely vaccinated. And when you take that into account, that also means that people who are Republican, or who we all have been told are vaccine hesitant, have been overwhelmingly getting the vaccine. And so when I look at this data, it tells me that what we're being told is that, Rogan is out here just like spreading lies. It's causing, like so many people in this country to be vaccine hesitant, but that just does not appear to be the case. I mean, it seems as though, with all the disinformation flying out there about, vaccines, people are still going out there and getting the shots. And these numbers are in fact improving as time has gone on. When it comes to some of these stats, I just want everyone to know that I will have links in the episode description. So for those who want to look at these stats for themselves and the sources that I'm getting them from, they will be in the episode description. But I think the point that I'm trying to drive home here is, for the longest time, I feel as though we've been having a conversation around like people who are unvaccinated in this country because people were worried about, unvaccinated people, like, and the level of transmissibility that they had, and that they would be infecting other people, who, and just giving the virus to people. But, I gotta say, currently in this age of Omicron now being the dominant strain here in the country, yeah, it's really, COVID has now evolved to a place where even if you're vaccinated, you are still you're still transmitting the virus, regardless if you are vaccinated or not. And the fact of the matter is that if you are vaccinated, which I also am, I advocate that people do get the vaccines. They are working exactly how they were, designed to do. They are preventing severe hospitalizations and death. In fact, the CDC has said that 99% of all COVID deaths since May of last year have been in unvaccinated people. And so the data is really supporting the fact that these vaccines do in fact work. And if you have the vaccine, I don't think you really need to be, and this is just my opinion. I don't think you need to be afraid of unvaccinated people and them giving you, COVID. Even if you catch it, your vaccination has the ability to protect you from serious harm from this virus, just as it would if you were to catch COVID from a vaccinated person. So I really do believe, like, at this moment in time, if people are choosing to be unvaccinated, I don't think that that's really, like, anyone's business but their own. I think that, at this point, in the pandemic, that's a decision that they're making for their own life. And so if people want to seek out this bad information, if they want to hear inaccuracies about vaccines that are not true, and make decisions about their own lives, about not wanting to get vaccinated, honestly, that's on them. I would hope that we would be still putting in place as much good information as absolutely possible to help people, guide them to a better decision. But at the end of the day, that is a decision that they have to make for themselves. And so telling these people that they can't have this bad information, I don't know. It was a different story when it felt like their bad decisions were affecting the lives of other people. But it would seem now, especially now that we are getting up to the 75, percent fully vaccinated adults, in the country, honestly, what's left over is that, the unvaccinated are more or less just harming themselves. So if people want to go down that path, they can go down that path. I think the rest of us who are vaccinated are going to be mostly okay if we come into contact with COVID. But, let me be clear about one thing. When we talk about whether or not podcasts like this are harmful, yes, there are some people who are, genuinely, like, led astray by conversations like this, especially when, these doctors come on, Malone and McCullough, and they perpetrate information that is not credible whatsoever. It is harmful, but I don't think it is as harmful as we are making it out to be. I just truthfully speaking, I think that most of the country, from looking at the data here, has become fully vaccinated. So the quote unquote harm of podcasts like this might be a little overstated. But if anything, I think what ends up happening here, if you do try to go ahead and get rid of conversations like this, it might actually backfire with your intent. So what should we be doing? Labeling the episodes is the route that Spotify is going on now, saying that they're going to label any episode that has conversations around COVID. I believe that's a good thing to do. I also heard that Rogan was planning on having more doctors on who would dispute the claims of these other doctors on in the future. That's a good thing to do. I still think that they should have these people on at the same time, so that when these bad claims are made, they can be rebutted in real time. Because unfortunately, you're only really giving more power to bad claims if you try to banish them to some dark corner of the internet, if you're trying to remove it off of Spotify in a show of, like, oh, we're not going to let you, spread this bad information. It's actually just going to make it more popular. I I wouldn't have known the names of these doctors if it wasn't for this controversy. I think it only shines a brighter spotlight on this bad information by trying to do that. And if the goal is actually to squash misinformation, if the goal is to, like quell, some of the hype around this bad information, I mean, this is actually the exact wrong thing to do. I mean, we should be engaging with this information, because what this really comes down to, in my opinion, is a lack of education. People are not educated thoroughly about what is going on with the vaccines. They're not having their questions answered. And so you don't really combat a lack of education by continuing to foster the environment that led to the lack of education. So people need to have these takes combated in real time. And I was able to find a doctor who also, I guess, believes in that exact same philosophy. In a show that I watch pretty consistently called Breaking Points, they had on a doctor by the name of Dr. Vinay Prasad. He came on to Breaking Points and spent about 30 minutes talking about how he went through the podcasts, both of them, both with Malone and McCullough, and he wrote, I think, a 3,000 word response on his Substack to every single claim that was made in that podcast. And let me just play a little quick clip so that you guys just know a little bit more about Dr. Vinay Prasad's credentials, so you can understand why he's a good expert to rebut their information.
Okay, great. So, I'm an associate professor here in epidemiology and biostatistics at the University of California, San Francisco. I'm also a hematologist oncologist. I'm a practicing doctor. I think this is my 7th year attending. And so I still run clinics. I attend on service, and I do research on evidence. Literally what my laboratory studies is the quality of evidence and how to appraise evidence. And so, I took those skills and I turned it to these 2 3-hour podcasts. And that's what you get in this essay, sort of what they got right and what they got wrong. I think it's important to talk about both.
So I watched that entire 30-minute conversation with Dr. Vinay Prasad. It was a great conversation. I really appreciated him coming onto that podcast and kind of breaking down some of that extra information. I thought it was just good to know exactly what the rebuttals were to some of the bad claims that were out there. Just thought it was a great piece of information. And I did read over his essay that he printed off. And I'm not going to read off everything here. I will have a link to this in the episode description along with some of the other links. But I kind of just wanted to read the last couple paragraphs that he had posted in here, because I think this is actually a pretty decent summary of my feelings as well on this situation. So I'm just going to read this off here really quickly. He says, the efforts to censor Malone and McCullough have massively backfired, with both men gaining prominence and publicity from the attempts to shut down their speech. More generally, I strongly disagree with the efforts to censor scientists, even if they are incorrect, and no matter the implications of their words, as I believe the harm of censorship far exceed any short-term gains. One problem, which has been on full display in this controversy, is that censorship may draw more attention to incorrect ideas. Another is that in the middle of any crisis, the answers to many scientific and policy questions will be uncertain. Disagreements on these questions is natural, and attempts to suffocate quote unquote harmful speech run the risk of stifling critical debates, including by silencing third parties who may have important contributions, but who fear the political or reputational consequences of speaking up. Perhaps the most serious objection to censorship is that the censors themselves are not fit for the task. Censors are unaccountable. They may be biased, misinformed, or uneducated. They may lack perspective. In short, they are as fallible as the people they are trying to censor. This is especially true in science, where, as history shows us, consensus views can turn out to be false, while controversial or heretical ideas can be vindicated. Finally, in the modern world, where the censor is so often a giant technology company, there is a tremendous potential for abuse. The same tools used to suppress scientific misinformation may someday be used to solidify political power and stifle dissent. And that, I think, in summary, is really what I am worried about when I think about censorship. Because when we talk about censorship of anything, I think it has to be a grave threat, like a massive threat, in order to legitimately stifle speech. You know, when Donald Trump was kicked off of Twitter last year, that felt that felt like appropriate given what had happened on January 6th. When Alex Jones gets banished off of every platform known to man, given everything that he's done over the years, I don't bat an eye at that. Like, those are times where censorship makes sense, but censorship should be an extreme option. It should be an extreme option. And I just don't think that what we are discussing here today warrants that extreme option, because the thing about censorship is it always starts out with the best of intentions, but the pendulum always swings back the other way. And so when we're talking about battling misinformation, disinformation, no to censorship, yes to engagement, engagement over and over again. Combat bad information with better information. That is the way to go about this. Now, I want to just conclude talking about the racist language on his podcast. I had written out most of this episode a couple nights ago, and then I came across the videos of Joe Rogan saying the N-word over and over and over and over again. And I'm not going to lie, it definitely changed quite a bit of my feelings about how I wanted to go about this episode and how I am going to be thinking about Joe Rogan going forward. Because I saw the video, and then I saw his apology afterwards. And he was saying that in the video, he was saying the N-word a bunch in a way of in context. So meaning that he was saying it because he was referring to somebody else who had said it in each one of these instances. And he also profusely apologized for calling Black people in an all Black neighborhood Planet of the Apes, or something along those lines. Now, he says that these were all happening about 10 or so years ago. I had a really hard time, swallowing all of this. Let me also add the fact that he said that, in no way, shape, or form was he, trying to be racist. He wasn't saying that word in a racist way. And this is something that I've heard other people say in the past. I've actually, just in recent years, for those of you who don't know, I'm a Black person. I would hope that most people would know that who listen to this podcast. I've actually had a conversation just about a year or so ago where I was speaking with a white lady, and she also used the N-word in front of me in a similar context. And in that moment, I got very, very upset. And it dawned on me that she, like Rogan probably did back in the day, just didn't see anything wrong with using the word in that fashion, because, just thought that they weren't saying it in a racist way. And I'm just blown away by people who have those thoughts go through their head. There's a part of me that always tries to understand people. I think it's the part of me that went to college for psychology. I'm always trying to understand why people think the way they think. But I would hope that most people would know at this point in our society that that's just not a word that you can say if you're a white person. I mean, just keeping it real with everybody, as a Black person, I don't say that word. It's a fucking terrible, disgusting word. I wish that everyone would stop saying it, but I just don't think, society as a whole is there yet. But it's a different conversation for a different day. And maybe there was a part of me that was willing to almost accept that bullshit apology, because ignorance is abound in society. As much as I want to assume that everyone knows that you shouldn't say that fucking word anymore. But then I saw another video of him, and I posted this one on Instagram, from 2017, where he had on, I believe he's a comedian, something Fitzgibbons. I forget what the guy's last name is. But anyway, in the clip that I posted, he's egging this person on, trying to get him to say it over and over and over again. And then when the guest finally says it, like Joe like cackles out in laughter. And this was only like 5 years ago, after, Joe claimed in his apology video that he, like hasn't said the word in a long time. And I'm sorry, he even went on to say it himself in this 2017 video. So while I never listened to the Joe Rogan Experience ever because I thought Joe was some great person, I never left the Joe Rogan Experience prior to, just these last few days thinking to myself that Joe was a bad person. I thought Joe was a misguided person. Joe was kind of a moron. He wasn't the smartest person in the world, but I was there for his guests. Like, I was there for whatever conversation was happening. I wasn't really there for him. But my perception of him has definitely changed after seeing, these recent videos, because I understand that maybe in his mind, he believed that he wasn't being racist, but that doesn't change the fact that he was being fucking racist. Now, the real question that I wanted to ask myself is, and probably other people are also talking about, is saying racist things make you a racist? I know that we're kind of getting a little bit into minutia here, but the way I define these things is I think that ignorant people can make mistakes and say and do racist things, but that might not make them a racist. And how I categorize someone who is a racist is someone who will say or do racist things. They understand that they are harming somebody and they don't care because they feel like they're allowed to, or they feel like they, are superior, that people of these other races are inferior. I don't believe that Rogan falls into that category, but it's still no excuse for that. And honestly, that little apology video, I just don't think it's good enough, truthfully speaking. That was incredibly racist, like things that he was doing, comparing Black people to apes. And then even if you were ignorant 10 years ago, you were still making fun of it 5 years ago. At that point in time in 2017, I mean, there really is no excuse for that. So I've definitely lost respect for the person. I'm going to have a hard time, I think, probably ever turning that podcast back on again. But with all that being said, I still fall into the exact same place. And this is how I'm going to close out this conversation. I just do not believe that censoring Joe Rogan is the answer. I understand that everyone would want to censor him. He's said racist shit. He's had on vaccine skeptics. He's had on like right-wing, like bigots. I mean, I'm sure that the easy thing to do would be to say, let's just banish him off the internet. He's a problem. He's toxic. But I promise you, like in my heart of hearts, I do believe that would cause more harm than good. People like that don't deserve to be censored. I think it would actually just create more of a toxic storm than need be. I think that's just a great way to kind of like close this out. Censorship is not the answer. It just isn't. I'm sorry. I know it's easy. I know it's convenient. It would feel nice. I mean, feel like almost like a win and an own, but it's just really not the solution that we're all looking for if the goal is to create a better society. Censorship will always come back the other direction, and it really will always be used as a tool of the powerful to attack the powerless eventually, even if it starts out with the best of intentions right now. So with that being said, I'm going to conclude this conversation about Joe Rogan. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we will have my guest for the week. Stay tuned. Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us for this episode of Independent Thought. I want to first thank my guest, Leah, the host of the Take Up Space podcast. That was her third appearance on the podcast. It's always good to have her back on. It's actually a very interesting guest segment. It was, I think, the first time maybe ever, or definitely in the last 2 seasons, that I had a guest on where I did not plan out that conversation. Like, I always have at least bullet points for the conversation, but Leah is one of those rare people where I felt comfortable just kind of freestyling the conversation. We just really just let that go wherever it went. And I thought it came out great. So my way of saying Leah's pretty awesome. Love having conversations with her about anything. Check out her podcast. She's fantastic. I want to say thank you to all of the subscribers of Independent Thought. Thank you for tuning in each and every week. It is a huge deal to me that you show up and check out the podcast. Also to my patrons, everyone who is not just listening to the podcast, but they are investing in the podcast. So many thanks to each and every one of you. I am hoping to using your investment to definitely taking this to a different level here this year. So thank you so much. As far as what's coming next for the podcast is concerned, we have 2 bonus episodes and 3 full episodes. One of which will be a solo full episode for the rest of this season. And then once this season ends, I will be reformatting the podcast going forward. So season 5 will look very different as far as how my podcast is laid out. Shorter episodes are coming, everyone. Shorter episodes are coming. So, but won't be shorter on content. You'll see what I mean. Anyway, the last thing that I want to update as far as like upcoming content is concerned, YouTube content will be resuming very shortly here. If you are not subscribed to my YouTube channel yet, please go subscribe to the YouTube channel and turn on the notifications, because YouTube is terrible about notifying people when I post anything. So please not only subscribe, but click the notification bell. So finally, as we close out this episode, I just wanted to touch on the Rogan thing one more time. I know I said quite a bit about it in the first segment, but I think the thing that was really hard for me was I went into this whole situation having a pretty decent opinion about Joe Rogan. Not saying like, oh, he's some great person, I'll defend him to the death. But if you had asked me about Joe Rogan's podcast, I'm like, oh, it's pretty entertaining. Oh yeah, it's not too bad. I hadn't listened to the episodes where he had on McCullough and Malone, so I wasn't aware that those had happened. I had no idea about his racist language over the years. Again, I think I've only listened to the podcast like 20 or 30 times, somewhere in that range over the last like 3 or 4 years. I think was the first time I discovered his podcast, like in 2018. But from all the times that I had listened, I had felt as if I was enjoying it. I was enjoying it. I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. And when people would say bad things about it, like in previous years, I just didn't understand it. I didn't understand where the hate came from. It seemed, I don't know. It didn't seem to add up given the experience I was having with it. But now having to take this deep dive, I understand why some people are as upset as they are. I share some of that now, given what I've seen. But yeah, it was tough. I heard a lot of different takes on this. I listened to, I think, Trevor Noah talk about it. I listened to Breaking Points talk about it. I listened to Kyle Kalinske talk about it. I listened to some other people talk about it. I saw so many takes, mostly on Twitter. It was like Twitter was flooded for days with nothing but either attacking Joe Rogan or defending Joe Rogan. Someone saying boycott Spotify, other people saying I stand with Joe Rogan. It just felt, it was a swarm of takes. And so I was ingesting everyone's take at the same time trying to, I guess, get a better formulation of my own. And, the more I thought about it, the more I knew I was always going to come down to somewhere in the place of censorship is just not going to solve any problems that you might have with Joe Rogan's podcast. But man, there's just no defense for some of this shit. There's just no defense for it. And I'm not going to sit here and try to defend the man. Like that, there's no defense for some of the things that he said, for some of the guests who have been on his podcast. It's just like, I listened to him in the past and heard him talk about how he tries to insulate himself from how popular it actually is, because he feels like if he takes it all in, then it would, I guess, change how he went about things. But I think on some level he needs to take some of it in, because I don't think even he has a full grasp of how big his platform has become. Like, Tucker Carlson has the largest audience on cable TV for news. Joe Rogan's podcast has 5 times Tucker Carlson's audience. Spotify likens one episode of the Joe Rogan Experience to be the equivalent of an impact on their platform that Taylor Swift has when she drops a new album. And that's every day that he drops an episode. So his intentional blind spot with not recognizing his impact on the country, it's a problem. It's a problem. And I know that earlier in the podcast, I said that I didn't think I thought his influence was being overstated. And now I'm saying something that sounds contradictory. But I don't think it's contradictory in the sense that while I think that Joe Rogan has a huge influence, like on a lot of people at large, it's obvious to me at the same time that influence is also not translating into people like in mass not getting, the vaccine. The numbers say otherwise. Like when this pandemic began, they were talking about herd immunity. I know that they've changed their definition on what that means in the last few months, but we're getting close to numbers that they were talking about. So the country is continuing to get vaccinated, regardless of everything that's been happening. The numbers are still going up. People are getting the vaccine. The vaccines are working, and you're seeing policy shift now because of it. So I think at the end of the day, while I'm disgusted by some of the things that I saw, and I'm disappointed in the decisions that Joe has made, the vaccines are definitely working. And I think that this reaction to his podcast has been definitely overblown. I mean, it's definitely, there's more hype around this than is warranted, but if you want to be hype about something, this is how I want to close out this episode. There is something to be hype about, because as I was saying earlier in the podcast, 99% of people who have died in America since May of 2021 from COVID are unvaccinated. Now, try to just imagine for a second that that's probably true in the whole world, that the people who are largely, at risk of dying from COVID are people who are unvaccinated. And while people are really worried here in America about the fact that, people spreading vaccine misinformation is leading to vaccine hesitancy, the real issue with people not getting vaccines, I shouldn't say the real issue, that's kind of minimizing. The larger issue of people not getting the vaccine is access, not here in America, but abroad, particularly in Africa. I said this during my booster shot episode earlier in the season, and unfortunately, it's still true. The continent of Africa, which has 54 countries, and I believe over 1 billion people, has a vaccination rate of 11%. And it's not because of hesitancy, it's because of access. These countries do not have access to the vaccine because they're just waiting to get more and more shipments, and they're just not coming. And I mean, like they are coming at this like glacially slow pace. Because while the major vaccine companies were ready, willing, and able to distribute their vaccines, not just 1 dose, not just 2 doses, but 3 doses into very rich and wealthy first world nations, the continent of Africa has been left hanging out to dry. And so who knows how many, I don't know, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but it seems criminal to me that we're talking about how, people are choosing not to get the vaccine being this massive problem when there are people who are begging to get the vaccine who can't get it because of greedy companies who would rather keep their patents on their vaccine versus allowing their formulas to be replicated in a generic fashion so that countries all over the world can develop their own vaccines. And so there could be finally some relief to countries who don't currently have access. But instead, we left these countries hanging out to dry, and there's little to no coverage whatsoever on this. And so if I'm sitting here asking myself who has led to more vaccine, I guess like who has led to like more people not having, the ability to get the vaccine, like random bad information, here in America on a Joe Rogan podcast, or greedy corporations not allowing their vaccines to be given out to nations around the world who need it. I think the outrage should be pointed at the greedy corporations who are not allowing their vaccines to be sent out to other nations around the world, particularly in Africa. If you were to Google right now vaccination rates by country, Google will pull up a chart for you. And if you click on the little tab that allows you to rank it, you can go down and you can look at all the countries that are at the bottom. They are all in Africa. There are several countries in Africa that have less than 1% of a vaccination rate. And that has nothing to do with hesitancy. So it just feels like people's rage is just misguided. It's not being directed in the right place. It just feels like another example in a long line of examples of where we're being misdirected to be upset with something else. Meanwhile, greedy corporate America once again is making off in the other direction, getting away with whatever the fuck they want to. And it's just disgusting to me. But with all that being said, thank you all for tuning into this episode today. I was very uncertain about saying any of this because I knew that, people just really, I'm sure people wanted me to come on here and just dunk on Rogan and say a bunch of nasty shit about him. And that was never what this episode was going to be about. And I knew I was probably going to say some things about the vaccine that made people maybe a little uncomfortable. Maybe I said something not quite as well as I should have. I was kind of frozen in fear thinking about recording this episode. But, I think during the course of having a podcast at some point in time, you're always going to be intimidated by an episode. So just had to just record it and see where it goes. Thank you all for listening. See you in the next episode.